When people talk about long COVID, the conversation almost always goes straight to lungs, brain fog, or fatigue that won't quit. Almost nobody brings up the testicles. But there's now years of actual follow-up data on men who recovered from COVID-19, tracking their hormone levels for a full year afterward. And it tells a genuinely surprising story that has real relevance for anyone trying to build muscle, recover from training, or just feel like themselves again after getting sick. So today, I want to walk through what the research actually shows about COVID-19's effect on testosterone and testicular function, including a detail from more recent studies that overturns the simple explanation most people settled on early in the pandemic. So, Arthur No-Fee, Fitness here. Hello and welcome. Let's start with why the testicles were ever a target for this virus in the first place. SARS-CoV-2 enters human cells through a receptor called ACE2, and it turns out ACE2 is expressed at high levels in testicular tissue, specifically on Sertoli cells and Leydig cells, the exact cells responsible for supporting sperm production and manufacturing testosterone. Early in the pandemic, the working assumption was straightforward. The virus directly infects these cells and damages them from the inside. But newer laboratory research using actual human testicular tissue cultures, including three-dimensional testicular organoids grown specifically to study this question, found something more nuanced. When researchers tried to get the virus to productively infect these cells directly, they largely couldn't. Instead, the damage appears to be what scientists call a bystander effect, meaning the injury to the testicle isn't from the virus invading those cells directly, it's collateral damage from the massive inflammatory response the rest of the body mounts against the infection, specifically elevated inflammatory signaling molecules like interleukin-6 flooding the bloodstream and disrupting the delicate hormonal machinery inside the testicle from the outside. Now let's get into the actual numbers, because this is where it becomes genuinely relevant rather than just interesting biology. Researchers in Milan followed a large cohort of men who had been hospitalized with confirmed COVID-19 and found that at the time of hospital admission, nearly 90% of these men had testosterone levels low enough to meet the clinical definition of hypogonadism. That part isn't shocking on its own. Acute, severe illness of almost any kind can temporarily suppress hormone production. What is genuinely notable is what happened next. The same research team followed these men out to 7 months after recovery and found that while testosterone levels had increased significantly compared to their hospital admission values, 55% of these men still had testosterone concentrations low enough to be classified as hypogonadal 7 months after they'd already recovered from the illness itself. When the same group extended their follow-up to a full 12 months, roughly 30% of the men were still sitting in that hypogonadal range, meaning for a meaningful portion of this cohort, testosterone had not fully normalized even after an entire year had passed. Here's a detail that adds another layer to this, and it's the kind of finding that should make you think differently about the relationship between your hormonal health and how your body handles illness in general. The same researchers found that the lower a man's testosterone was measured to be at the time of hospital admission, the worse his clinical outcomes tended to be, and the lower his probability of ever fully recovering to a normal hormonal range at follow-up. They also found that men carrying a heavier burden of other health conditions using a standardized comorbidity scoring system were significantly less likely to see their testosterone recover throughout the entire follow-up period. This doesn't prove that low testosterone directly worsens how your body fights off a viral infection. The researchers themselves are careful about that distinction, but it does suggest that a man's baseline hormonal and metabolic health going into an illness like this may meaningfully shape how well he comes out the other side of it, which is a genuinely different way of thinking about testosterone than just muscle and libido. It's worth mentioning the fertility angle briefly too, since it fits the same pattern. Separate research following men after even moderate, non-hospitalized COVID-19 cases found measurable impairments in sperm concentration and motility that persisted for months after a full recovery from the illness itself, alongside elevated inflammatory markers detected directly in semen samples that remained elevated for more than 2 months post-recovery. This lines up with the broader picture that this virus's effect on male reproductive and hormonal function isn't limited to the sickest patients in a hospital bed. It shows up to some degree even in men who had a fairly ordinary course of illness at home. There's also physical, visible evidence of this happening inside the tissue itself, not just in blood hormone numbers. Researchers using a specialized ultrasound technique called sonoelastography, which measures the actual stiffness of tissue rather than just producing a static image, examined the testicles of men recovering from COVID-19 and found measurable changes in tissue characteristics consistent with the kind of subclinical inflammation and structural change you'd expect from significant cellular stress, even in men who had no obvious symptoms pointing toward their testicles at all. This matters because it shows the impact isn't purely a number on a lab report that might reflect some indirect, temporary stress response. There's an actual physical correlate happening inside the organ itself that ultrasound technology can pick up. It's also worth being precise about what this research is and isn't describing, because there's a lot of confused information floating around this exact topic. Every study referenced here is specifically studying men who were infected with the actual SARS-CoV-2 virus, tracking outcomes tied to the infection and the body's inflammatory response to fighting it off. This has nothing to do with vaccination status, and conflating the two would be a genuine misrepresentation of what these researchers actually measured. The mechanism described here, viral infection triggering a systemic cytokine storm that disrupts testicular signaling, is specific to the disease itself, not to any medical intervention used against it. There's a detail from a separate cohort study out of Turkey worth mentioning too, since it adds another data point to the 12-month recovery picture. Researchers tracked a smaller group of men and found that at the 12-month mark, half of those who returned for follow-up still show testosterone levels low enough to be classified as hypogonadal, a result that lines up closely with the larger Milan cohort, despite being a completely separate research group working with a different patient population. When multiple independent research teams in different countries keep landing on roughly the same 12-month recovery rate, somewhere between 30 and 50% of men still affected, that consistency is exactly the kind of signal that makes a finding like this worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as a fluke tied to one particular hospital or patient group. So what do you actually do with this information? If you had a genuinely rough case of COVID-19, especially one severe enough to involve hospitalization, and you've noticed persistent fatigue, a stalled recovery in the gym, reduced libido, or strength that just won't come back the way it used to months after you were cleared as physically recovered, this research suggests it's worth actually getting blood work done rather than assuming it's simply lingering fatigue that will resolve on its own with time. The data shows recovery is real and does happen for most men. Testosterone did climb substantially between hospital admission and the later follow-up points in every one of these studies. But for a meaningful subset of men, that recovery is slow, incomplete, and stretches out well beyond the point where most people assume they should be back to normal. Given how directly testosterone ties into training capacity, recovery, and how you feel day to day, this is a genuinely useful thing to actually check rather than guess about. One more practical point worth adding, since guys often ask when it's even worth testing. Testing testosterone in the first few weeks right after an infection isn't especially useful, since almost any significant acute illness temporarily depresses hormone levels regardless of what caused it. And that early dip tends to resolve on its own for most men within a couple of months. Where this research becomes genuinely actionable is further out, somewhere in the range of 6 months to a year after a serious infection, if the fatigue, low libido, or training stall hasn't meaningfully improved. That's the window where these cohort studies show a real, identifiable subset of men are still hormonally affected, and it's specific enough now that a doctor can meaningfully act on it rather than just telling you to give it more time. Don't forget to subscribe, and you'll never pay fees for your fitness.